The first time it happened was in a kindergarten classroom in Omaha. The official story, the one that ran on the news for a week before being buried by a political scandal, was a gas leak, a freak explosion. But there were things that didn't fit. There was no fire. The building wasn't leveled, just the one room. And the bodies of the 20 children and their teacher, Mrs. Gable, were not burned or mangled. They were just gone. Vanished. The only thing left in the room was a fine white ash, blanketing every surface, and a single word written in the dust on the blackboard: enough. The strangest part. The part the first responders whispered about in bars for years afterward was the crater. A perfect, glass smooth bowl scooped out of the classroom floor, glowing with a faint residual light that made your teeth ache. I didn't know anything about that at the time. I was 1,000 miles away in Harmony Creek, Arizona, trying to fix a faulty cooling fan on the main receiver of the Scylla array. My name is Jack Carver. I was what you might call the resident grease monkey for a collection of radio telescopes that spent their days listening to the empty parts of the sky. It was a lonely job, perfect for a man who preferred the company of machines to people. The signal came in at 3:17 a.m. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a pulsar, not a quasar, not galactic background noise. It was a sound that crawled right into the back of your skull. A chittering. A dry insect-like clicking that sounded like a million cockroaches, skittering over a sheet of tin foil. It was layered, complex, and it had a rhythm, a cadence. It sounded almost like a language, a hateful, whispering language. I recorded it, of course. I ran it through every diagnostic program we had. The software screamed at me. The signal was impossible. It had no discernible point of origin. It wasn't coming from a star or a galaxy. It was coming from everywhere at once, like the universe itself had started whispering a secret it couldn't keep. I called Dr. Aris Thorne, the head of the project. He was a brilliant old bird who'd been chasing aliens his whole life. I woke him up. I didn't care. "What is it, Jack?" He'd mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "You need to hear this," I said, and played the recording over the phone. The silence on the other end was heavy. I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow. The chittering sound filled the space between us, a sound of dry, brittle things breaking. "My God," Thorne finally whispered. "They're here." "Who's here?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The cooling fan I was supposed to be fixing whirred back to life, then died again with a pathetic groan. "Not here, Jack," Thorne said, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and awe. "Not in a ship. They're on the line. They're in the signal. They're broadcasting." "Broadcasting what?" "Despair," he said, and the word hung in the air like a bad smell. "That isn't a language. It's an emotion. They're broadcasting hopelessness." I didn't understand. I went outside and stood under the massive white dish of the main telescope. It was pointed up at a sky full of indifferent stars. The Arizona air was cool and smelled of dust and sagebrush. But something was different. The silence wasn't empty anymore. If I stood perfectly still and held my breath, I could almost hear it. Faint, insistent. The sound of a billion tiny legs crawling their way into the world. The change in Harmony Creek was subtle at first. You could miss it if you weren't looking. It started with little things. Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses wilted and died overnight, turning a brittle, papery brown. The stray dogs that usually roamed the alleys vanished. The air seemed to get heavier, thicker, pressing down on your shoulders with an invisible weight. I drove into town for supplies 2 days after the signal started. The chittering was a constant, low-level hum in our equipment now. Dr. Thorne hadn't slept. He was hunched over his monitors, his face pale and waxy, surrounded by printouts of the signal's waveform. He looked like a man staring into his own open grave. The town felt wrong. The usual morning chatter at the diner was gone. People sat in their booths, staring into their coffee cups, not speaking. Their faces were slack, their eyes dull. When I said hello to Dale, the owner, he just grunted and slid a menu across the counter without looking at me. His hands were shaking. Sheriff Brody was there, a big man who usually filled the room with his presence. Today he looked smaller. He was stirring his coffee with a slow circular motion, over and over, his gaze fixed on the brown whirlpool he was creating. "Morning, Sheriff," I said, sliding into the booth opposite him. He looked up and it took a second for his eyes to focus on me. "Jack," he said, his voice was flat. "Quiet one today." "You could say that," I agreed. "Everything all right?" He shrugged, a heavy, tired movement. "Don't know, just a feeling. Got a call last night. Old man Hemlock said something was whispering to him from his television, even when it was off." "What'd you do?" "Went out there, nothing. Just the old man sitting in the dark crying. Said the whispers were telling him it was no use. No use doing anything at all." Brody took a long sip of his coffee. "Been getting a lot of calls like that. People feeling low, spooked. My deputy Kevin didn't show up for his shift. His wife called. Said he just got in his car and drove out into the desert. Didn't say where he was going." The chittering whisper. I felt a chill despite the diner's warmth. They were broadcasting despair. And it was working. This wasn't an invasion of ships and laser beams. It was an invasion of the mind. A slow, creeping poison that drained the will to live. I didn't tell Brody about the signal. What could I say? That aliens were sending sad thoughts from across the galaxy? He'd think I was crazy. He already thought I was a weirdo for living out at the observatory. I finished my breakfast and drove back out to the array. The desert landscape, usually so beautiful in its starkness, looked barren and threatening. The saguaro cacti seemed like skeletal hands reaching for a gray, uncaring sky. The chittering seemed louder out here, a constant thrum in the back of my mind. When I got back to the control room, Thorne was standing in front of the main speaker, his head cocked. He'd isolated a new layer in the signal. Beneath the skittering clicks, there was something else. A low, guttural moaning. It was a sound of profound, bottomless grief. "It's us," Thorne said, his voice barely a whisper. "That's the feedback. They broadcast the despair, we feel it, and it echoes back out into the cosmos. They're listening to us suffer. They're feeding on it." He pointed a trembling finger at a monitor. It showed a map of the world, dotted with red spots that were popping up like a rash. Omaha was one of them. Another was a freighter, in the middle of the Pacific, that had just sent a garbled distress call before going silent. Another was a small village in the Swiss Alps. "What are those red dots?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Anomalous energy readings," Thorne said. "Massive instantaneous releases. I didn't understand at first, but now I think I do." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying kind of clarity. "It's the sound of a soul breaking." The third day was when the fog rolled in. Not a real fog. You couldn't see it, but you could feel it. It was a mental fog, a blanket of apathy that settled over Harmony Creek and squeezed the life out of it. The school closed. Not because of an official order, but because only a handful of kids showed up, and the teachers just stared at the walls, unable to find the words to begin a lesson. The gas station ran out of gas because no one had bothered to order a new tanker. The shelves at the general store grew bare. The chittering, as Thorn had started calling them, were insidious. Their weapon wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet. It was the little voice in your head that told you to stay in bed, that it didn't matter if you ate, that calling a friend was too much effort. It amplified every doubt, every fear, every regret, until they were the only things left. Thorn and I were trapped at the observatory, not by force, but by a sense of purpose that was becoming harder and harder to hold on to. We kept the generators running, kept the systems online. We were the only ones listening, the only ones who knew the enemy's name. "They're not conquerors," Thorn explained, pacing the control room. He'd lost weight, and his lab coat hung on him like a shroud. "They're farmers. We are the crop. Our despair is their harvest." He showed me his research. He'd been cross-referencing the signal with historical records. He found echoes of it, fainter and more scattered during the Black Plague in Europe, during the Great Depression, during every major war. "They've been tending their garden for a long time," he said, his voice grim. "But this is different. This time, they've turned up the volume. This is the final harvest." The moaning in the signal was louder now, a global chorus of misery. The chittering were feasting. I tried calling Sarah, my ex-wife. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since she'd packed her bags and left Harmony Creek for a job in Phoenix. She said she needed a place with a future, and our town, our marriage, had none. The phone rang and rang, but it just went to voicemail. Her recorded voice, once so full of life, sounded tinny and distant. I tried to leave a message, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? "The world is ending, and I miss you." It sounded pathetic even in my own head. The chittering whisper agreed. Pathetic. Useless. That night, Sheriff Brody's cruiser pulled up to the observatory gate. He got out slowly, his movements heavy. I went out to meet him. "Jack," he said, his face illuminated by the cruiser's headlights. He looked 10 years older than he had 3 days ago. "We have a problem." "More whispers?" I asked. He shook his head. "Worse. People are starting to disappear." My blood ran cold, like the kids in Omaha. Brody's eyes widened. "How did you know about that?" "I work in a place that listens to strange things," I said. It was the best explanation I could manage. "The Millers," Brody said, his voice cracking. "The whole family. Their neighbor called, said she hadn't seen them all day. I went over. The house was empty. Dinner was on the table, cold. Television was on, but they were gone. All of them. And there was this dust, a fine white ash all over the living room." He paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. "And the floor, Jack. To here is a hole in their living room floor, like something just scooped it out." We stood there in the humming silence of the desert night. The stars above seemed to mock us with their cold, distant light. The enemy wasn't at the gates. It was already inside. It was in our heads, in our homes, whispering us into oblivion. And sometimes when the despair became too much to bear, it didn't just break your spirit. It erased you from existence. The town was dying. It was a slow, quiet death, not a dramatic one. The power grid finally failed on the 5th day. No one at the regional station was answering the phones. No one was there to flip the switches. Harmony Creek plunged into a darkness that felt absolute. Our generators at the observatory kept humming, a bubble of light and sound in an ocean of silence and despair. Thorn was becoming more and more agitated. He'd stopped trying to analyze the chittering's broadcast. Now he was focused entirely on the red dots popping up on his world map, the erages, as he called them. "It's not suicide, Jack," he said, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "It's a reaction, a physical reaction to absolute psychological collapse. The human mind, the human soul, it has a breaking point. When it snaps, it takes the body with it. It unravels." I thought about the Miller family, sitting down for dinner, the whispers from the television getting louder and louder in their minds, telling them their worries were pointless, their love was a lie, their lives were meaningless. What was the last thing they thought? Did they even know what was happening as they dissolved into ash and memory? The real horror began to set in. It wasn't just that the chittering were feeding on our despair, they were causing it, and when it reached a peak, it created these events, these erasures. And Thorn had a new theory about that. "The energy signature of the erasures," he mumbled, staring at a complex graph. "It's not just a release, it's a transmission, a powerful one. It's like a final scream that blasts out into the void." "So the chittering get a final meal?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Maybe," Thorn said, his eyes distant. "Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's a side effect they don't care about. Or maybe..." He trailed off, looking lost. The silence in town was worse than the noise. We drove in with Brody, his cruiser, the only vehicle moving on the empty streets. We were looking for survivors, for anyone who hadn't succumbed. We found a few. A small group huddled in the back of the church, led by the town pastor, a man whose faith was being eroded with every passing hour. They were lighting candles, singing hymns in thin, wavering voices. It was a brave sound, but it felt like shouting into a hurricane. We found Sarah's best friend, Maria, locked in her house. She was sitting in a corner of her bedroom, rocking back and forth, humming a tune from a children's show. She didn't recognize us. Her eyes were empty vessels. The whispers had taken her. There was nothing we could do. Brody had to force the door shut, leaving her to her humming. The sound of the lock clicking into place was one of the saddest sounds I'd ever heard. "We can't save them all, Jack," Brody said, his jaw tight. "We can barely save ourselves." He was right. I felt the pull of it myself. A constant, nagging weight. The voice that said this was hopeless. That Thorn was a crazy old man. That Brody was a fool. That I was a failure who couldn't even keep his own marriage together, let alone save the world. It was a hard voice to ignore. It was my own voice, twisted and made ugly. That night we lost the pastor. We were taking the survivors from the church back to the observatory, which was the most fortified place we had. The pastor was riding in the back of Brody's cruiser. He was quiet the whole way. When we arrived, he wouldn't get out. "I can't," he whispered, his face a mask of agony. "He's been telling me my whole life. My faith it was for nothing. To hear is no one listening. No one but them." Brody tried to talk to him. "Reverend, we need to go. It's not safe out here." The pastor just shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. "It's not safe anywhere." And then it happened. There was no sound. Just a flash of brilliant, searing white light from inside the cruiser. It was an implosion of light. It lasted only a second. When it faded, the back of the cruiser was empty. A fine white ash coated the vinyl seats. And in the center of the seat where the pastor had been sitting, a small glassy crater was cooling in the sudden dark. We all stood there, stunned into silence. We had just witnessed it. A soul breaking. An erasure. The ultimate surrender. The chittering had claimed another one. And we were next. The erasure of the pastor changed everything. It wasn't a story from the news or a theory on Thorne's monitor anymore. It was real. We had seen it. The silent, brilliant flash was burned into my retinas. We got the few remaining survivors, a dozen or so numb and terrified people, into the observatory's main building. Brody started organizing a watch schedule, trying to create some semblance of order in the face of cosmic chaos. But everyone was rattled. The air was thick with a new kind of fear. Not just the fear of the whispers, but the fear of our own minds. The fear that at any moment one of us could just... Thorne, however, was energized. The horror of the event had shocked him out of his despair and into a feverish state of scientific obsession. He locked himself in the control room, re-watching the security footage of the pastor's erasure over and over again. He barely spoke to anyone. I brought him a cup of coffee. He was hunched over a light table, looking at a series of old faded photographs. They were from archives all over the world. A picture of a lone soldier standing on a blasted battlefield in World War I. A photo of a woman chained to a stake during the witch trials. A grainy image of a protester in front of a tank. In each photo near the subject, there was a strange, faint halo of light, a photographic anomaly that historians had dismissed as a developing error. "Look," Thorne said, his voice raspy. He pointed at the halo around the soldier. "And now look at this." He held up a still frame from our security camera, a single frame captured right before the pastor vanished. There it was. The same faint, ethereal glow surrounding his body like an aura. "It's not the despair that does it," Thorne said, his eyes blazing with discovery. "I was wrong. The despair is the catalyst, the pressure. But the reaction itself, that's something else." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't you see, Jack? The universe is all about balance, action and reaction. For every force, there is an equal and opposite force." "What are you talking about, Harris?" I asked, confused. "The chittering broadcasts despair. It's their weapon. It's an oppressive, crushing force. But what is the opposite of despair?" The word came to my lips before I even thought about it. Hope. Thorne grinned, a wild, manic expression. "Exactly. Hope. Not just a feeling, Jack. Not just a platitude. A force, a fundamental force of the universe. Just like gravity or electromagnetism. And it seems to be unique to sentient life that knows it's going to die. To humanity." He started pacing again. "The chittering have been farming us for millennia. They push us into the depths of despair. But they never understood. They can't feel hope, so they couldn't conceive of it as a weapon. For most people, the despair wins. They fade away, or they get erased. But for a tiny fraction, when they are pushed to the absolute brink, with nothing left to lose, something remarkable happens." He stopped and looked me right in the eye. "Their hope doesn't just keep them going. It ignites. It becomes a weapon of last resort. It's not a surrender. The erasure isn't a whimper. It's a bang. A final, defiant roar against the darkness. A roar that erases you from existence," I said, skeptical. "Yes, because the energy required is immense. It consumes the source. It's a self-destruct mechanism built into the human spirit. He was almost shouting now, his excitement echoing in the quiet control room. The Chittering thought they were harvesting us. They were wrong. They were accidentally forcing us to build bombs. Bombs made of pure, weaponized hope. He called it the Phoenix Protocol. A final, beautiful, terrible act of defiance. Humanity's secret weapon was the ability to turn its own spirit into a fire that could burn away the darkness, even if it meant burning itself up in the process. I looked at the world map on the screen. The red dots weren't just signs of defeat anymore. They were battlefields. Each one a story of a single unknown person pushed too far, who in their final moment refused to simply break. They fought back. They detonated. And, as I stood there, a terrifying thought began to form in my mind. If this was a war, and these hope bombs were our only weapon, how in the world could we ever hope to win? The Chittering learned fast. The broadcast changed. The constant, low-level hum of despair intensified, but it also became more focused. It was like they were hunting now, scanning the globe for pockets of resistance, for stubborn lights that refused to go out. And they had a new weapon. It started with a scratching sound at the main door of the observatory. Brody and I went to check, shotguns ready. Through the reinforced glass porthole, we saw them for the first time. They weren't creatures of flesh and blood. They looked like holes in the world. Vaguely insectoid shapes, tall and thin, made of shifting static and shadow. They had too many limbs, all of which moved with a sickening, twitching grace. Looking at them made your eyes water and your brain hurt, as if you were trying to comprehend a shape that wasn't meant for three-dimensional space. They were the physical manifestation of the Chittering sound, the static of the void given form. They didn't try to break down the door. They just stood there. And the psychic pressure ramped up. The whispers were no longer in the back of my mind. They were screaming, shouting, berating. You let Sarah go. You were too weak, a coward. You are a failure, Jack, a grease monkey waiting to die. Look at these people, they're counting on you. You'll let them all down. I saw Brody flinch. His knuckles were white on the stock of his shotgun. I could see the battle playing out on his face. The whispers were digging into him, too, finding his own private fears, his dead wife. The son who never called, the town he couldn't protect. Don't listen, I said, my own voice sounding thin. Easier said than done, he grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. The things outside didn't need to break the door. They were trying to break us. They were laying siege to our minds. We retreated back into the main common area, where the other survivors were huddled. The feeling of dread was suffocating. People were weeping quietly. A man named Frank, who used to run the hardware store, was arguing with his wife about something that happened 20 years ago. His voice full of venom. The Chittering broadcast was a solvent, dissolving the bonds between us. Thorne was a rock in the storm. His scientific certainty seemed to insulate him. They're here for us, he said, looking at the security monitors showing the silent, twitching figures. We're a beacon. We have generators, lights, people gathered together. We're a pocket of organized resistance, a candle in the dark. They want to snuff us out. The siege lasted for hours. The sun went down, and the desert was plunged into a total, profound blackness. The only light was from our humming fluorescence. The only sound was the generator, the quiet sobbing of the survivors, and the maddening, silent pressure from the things outside. Then, one of them found a weakness. A large window in the observatory's library. It wasn't reinforced. There was a sharp crack, and the window shattered inward. One of the shadow insects unfolded itself through the frame. It was even more horrifying up close. It was a shifting nightmare of clicking limbs, and a shape that refused to resolve. It had no face, no eyes, but you could feel its attention, a cold, hungry focus. Brody leveled his shotgun. "Get back!" he yelled. But before he could fire, a woman screamed. It was Martha, a retired librarian who had been one of the quietest of the group. She was backed into a corner, her face a mess of tears and terror. The creature turned its faceless head towards her. The psychic pressure in the room became unbearable. "It's over. You are old. You are alone. No one will even remember your name." I saw Martha's face change. The terror was replaced by a sudden shocking calm. She stopped crying. She stood up straight, her chin lifted. She looked directly at the creature of shadow. "No," she whispered, her voice clear and strong. "My name is Martha Prentice. I loved a good man. I raised 2 fine sons. I read stories to children for 40 years. I met her. And then I saw it. The aura. The faint white glow that Thorn had showed me. It started as a shimmer around her, then grew brighter, fiercer. The creature seemed to recoil, letting out a screech that wasn't sound but a blast of pure static in our minds. It lunged for her. Martha closed her eyes and smiled, a small, gentle smile of defiance. The world went white. The light was absolute. It wasn't like a flashbulb. It was like the universe had been dipped in bleach. It erased everything. Sound, sight, thought. There was a feeling of immense pressure, then a profound echoing silence. When my vision returned, blinking away spots, the library was a wreck. Books and papers were scattered everywhere. The window frame was blackened, and the creature, the shadow insect, was gone. Not just gone, but annihilated. A patch of the floor where it had stood was scoured clean, almost glassy. And where Martha Prentice had stood, there was only a fine white ash settling on the worn carpet, a small, neat pile. The last physical remnants of a woman who decided she mattered. The survivors were in shock. Some were screaming, others were staring blankly at the ash. But the oppressive psychic weight was gone. The whispers had stopped. Martha's final, defiant act had been more than just a last stand. It was a weapon. It had blasted the Chittering's presence away from us, at least for now. Brody was on one knee, breathing hard. What in God's name was that? "The Phoenix Protocol," Thorn said, his voice full of awe. He walked over to the pile of ash, his expression one of reverence. That was Martha Prentice fighting back. We all looked at the spot where the brave librarian had made her stand. It wasn't a place of death. It felt like a monument. The truth of our situation settled over me with the weight of a tombstone. We had a weapon, an ultimate weapon. But the ammunition was us, our lives, our souls. To win this war, we had to die. The implications were staggering. How could you build an army where every soldier could only fire once? How could you ask someone to do that? To willingly embrace such a complete and total end? The event seemed to have shaken the Chittering. For the next few hours, the observatory was quiet. The remaining creatures had retreated. Martha's hope bomb had punched a hole in their siege, giving us a moment to breathe, a moment to think. We gathered in the control room. The mood was grim, but there was a new element in the air, something that hadn't been there before. A sliver of angry, defiant purpose. Martha had shown us it was possible to fight back. They'll be back, Brody said, reloading his shotgun with steady hands. And they'll be more careful next time. He's right, Thorn agreed. They've seen our weapon now. They know what we're capable of. They'll adapt. They'll try to pick us off one by one, to break our morale until no one has the strength left to ignite. He looked at the large main dish of the Scylla array on the security monitor, pointed silently at the sky. A thought was forming behind his tired eyes. We can't win a war of attrition. We don't have the numbers. We need a decisive strike. A bigger bomb? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Thorn nodded slowly. The energy release. Heat's a product of the individual's will, their capacity for hope. Martha was a quiet woman, but she had a deep well of it. What if we could focus it? Amplify it? He turned to the main console, his fingers flying across the keys. He pulled up schematics of the radio telescope. This dish, its primary function is to collect and focus faint radio waves from deep space onto a single receiver. It's a massive amplifier. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with a terrible, brilliant idea. What if we could do the same thing with psychic energy? What if one of us, one person with enough hope, could stand at the focal point of that dish? My stomach turned to ice. He was talking about turning a person into a directed energy weapon. A rifle instead of a grenade. A single focused beam of pure hope shot into the sky. What would it target? Brody asked. The source, Thorn said, his voice trembling with the enormity of his own idea. The broadcast isn't just ambient noise. It has to have a source. A central consciousness. A hive mind. Something in orbit, or deeper in space. Something that's coordinating this attack. If we could hit that, we might be able to cut the head off the snake. He looked around the room, at the scared, exhausted faces of the survivors. Then his eyes met mine. We would need someone strong, he said quietly. Someone with a reason to hope. Someone who can stand in the heart of that storm and not just hold on, but push back. To build up that charge until it's ready. No one spoke. The hum of the generator was the only sound. We all knew what he was asking. He was looking for a volunteer to become a bullet. A bullet aimed at the heart of a nightmare. The plan was insane. It was the kind of desperate, last-ditch strategy that only gets proposed when every other option has been burned away. But as we sat in the sterile light of the control room, no one offered a better idea. We were trapped on a dying planet, hunted by psychic monsters. An insane plan was better than no plan at all. Thorn laid it out for us. He believed the Chittering's hive mind, or central nexus, was located at the L1 Lagrange point between Earth and the Moon. A gravitationally stable spot perfect for a hidden observer. It was from there, he theorized, that the main broadcast of despair originated. The main dish of the array can be aimed with pinpoint precision, he explained, pointing to a diagram on the screen. The focal point is a small platform, right in front of the receiver. We need to get our volunteer up there. They will become the emitter. The dish will collect and focus their Phoenix Protocol detonation into a tight beam and fire it straight at the target. And the person up there? Brody asked, though he already knew the answer. They will be consumed, Thorn said softly. More than consumed. Their entire being, their hope, their very essence will become the energy of the beam. There will be nothing left. A heavy silence fell over the room. The dozen survivors looked at each other, their faces pale. Who could do such a thing? Who had that kind of strength? My mind was a whirlwind. I thought of Sarah. I pictured her face, her smile. I imagined a world where she could be safe, where the whispers couldn't touch her. A world where people could laugh again without it feeling like a crime. That image, that tiny flicker of a better future, was the only thing that felt real in the suffocating darkness. It was a seed of hope. And in that moment, I knew. "I'll do it," I said. The words came out before I could stop them. Every head in the room turned to me. Brody's eyes were wide with a mixture of respect and alarm. Thorn just nodded slowly, a sad understanding on his face. "Jack." "No," Brody said. "You don't have to." "Who else?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "You need to lead these people, get them somewhere safe if this works. Thorn is the only one who can operate the array. The others." I looked at the terrified survivors. They're just trying to survive the next 5 minutes. I am the grease monkey. I know the structure. I know the machine. And I have a reason. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. The reason was mine. It was the memory of a woman's laughter and the dream of a quiet morning. It was all I had left. The chittering gave us no time to second guess. As if they'd overheard our plan, the siege renewed, but with a terrifying new strategy. The shadow creatures didn't just stand outside anymore. They began to phase. Panic erupted. We had to move, and we had to move now. "The path to the main dish is exposed," Brody shouted over the rising din. "We'll have to make a run for it." The plan was simple and suicidal. Thorn would stay in the control room to aim the dish. Brody would lead the other survivors to a fortified maintenance bunker, a quarter-mile away, creating a diversion. I would make a break for the main telescope, climb the gantry and get into position. "Once you are at the focal point, Jack, you have to hold on," Thorn instructed, his hands gripping my shoulders. "Don't let go too soon. I need to lock the dish onto the target. The whispers will be at their worst. They will throw everything they have at you. You have to fill yourself with hope. Think of everything you are fighting for. Let it build. Let it become a fire. When I give the signal, you let it go." Brody gave me his spare pistol. "Just in case," he said, his voice gruff. "Good luck, Jack." He didn't say goodbye. Neither of us could. We opened the main doors. The desert night was filled with the silent, twitching shapes of the chittering. They were everywhere, like a forest of nightmares. "Now!" Brody yelled. He and his group fired their weapons, running left towards the bunker. The creatures, drawn by the noise and aggression, swarmed after them. It was the opening I needed. I ran right, towards the colossal white dish that loomed against the starry sky like the bone of a dead god. My heart hammered in my chest. The whispers screamed in my head, a cacophony of failure and fear. But underneath it all, I held on to one image, Sarah's face. I reached the base of the gantry and started to climb, the cold metal rungs biting into my hands. The whole world seemed to be screaming at me to stop, to give up, to let the sweet, empty relief of despair wash over me. But I just kept climbing, one rung at a time, towards my appointment at the heart of the machine. The climb was a journey through my own personal hell. Every rung I grasped, a new whisper, a new failure, was screamed into my consciousness. The chittering knew I was the target now. The full force of their psychic assault was focused on me, a single point of light they were desperate to extinguish. Remember the day Sarah left? The look on her face? It wasn't sadness, Jack. It was relief. I gritted my teeth, pulling myself up another rung. My arms burned. You told your father you'd make something of yourself. Look at you. A glorified janitor about to die on a piece of scrap metal in the middle of nowhere. I kept climbing. The wind whipped around me, cold and sharp. Below, I could see the flashes of Brody's group fighting their way to the bunker. They were buying me time. Even if this works, what's the point? The world is broken. Humanity is scarred. You are not saving anything. You are just choosing a more elaborate way to die. The Whispers were clever. They didn't just shout. They reasoned. They used logic, twisting it into a weapon of despair. But I had my own weapon. A memory. Sarah and I years ago on a beach in California. The sun was warm. The ocean was loud. And for one perfect afternoon, nothing else in the world mattered. I focused on the feeling of her hand in mine, the warmth, the reality of it. She held my hand. I grunted out loud, the words torn from my lips by the wind. The simple statement was an act of defiance, a fact against their fiction. I reached the top of the gentry and stepped out onto the narrow catwalk that led to the focal point. The massive 100-meter dish curved away beneath me, a vast white bowl aimed at the heavens. The focal point itself was a small maintenance platform, no bigger than a kitchen table, suspended by steel struts directly over the sensitive receiver array. It was the loneliest place in the world. As I stepped onto the platform, the assault intensified to a level that was almost physical. My vision wavered. The structure seemed to sway. The Whispers were no longer just in my head. They were the wind, the stars, the very air I was breathing. The creatures of shadow were beginning to coalesce on the dish below me, crawling up the pristine white surface like spiders. Ixopoleskiv. Ephrai. The phrase, the end race the end. I staggered, my hand flying to my head. The pain was immense. My hope was a tiny candle flame, and a hurricane was trying to blow it out. Jack, can you hear me? Thorne's voice crackled through the small radio clipped to my jacket. I am locking the dish. Just hold on. You have to hold on. I looked up at the sky. At the Lagrange point, invisible to the naked eye, was our enemy, the source of all this pain. I closed my eyes. The beach memory wasn't enough anymore. It was too small. I needed more fuel for the fire. I didn't think of the past. I thought of the future. I imagined a child I would never meet, sitting in a classroom, learning about a time when the world almost went dark. I imagined two strangers falling in love, their hope for a future together, a quiet, powerful force. I imagined someone somewhere looking up at the stars, not with fear, but with wonder. I pictured a world without the Whispers, a world where a bad day was just a bad day, not a siren call for cosmic predators. I wasn't just fighting for my memories, I was fighting for their future. For all their futures. For all their futures. The tiny candle flame of my hope didn't just flicker. It grew. It fed on these images, on this desperate, beautiful dream of a tomorrow. It became a bonfire. The pain in my head receded, pushed back by the growing light inside me. I opened my eyes. The shadow creatures crawling up the dish faltered, as if blinded by a light only they could see. The Whispers in my head turned from insidious reason to panicked, hateful shrieking. They knew they were losing. Jack, it's locked! Thorne's voice was a triumphant shout over the radio. Let them have it, son. Let it go. I took a deep breath. The air filled my lungs. I felt a strange calm settle over me. There was no fear left. There was only purpose. I thought of Sarah one last time. not with sadness or regret, but with a profound, aching love. "This is for you," I whispered. Then I let go. I released all of it, the memories, the dreams, the love, the anger, the fierce, stubborn hope of a species that refused to lie down and die. I offered it all up to the sky. And my world didn't go white. It became light itself. From the maintenance bunker, Sheriff Brody saw it happen. He and the 10 other survivors had made it, barricading the door just as the shadow creatures swarmed the entrance. They were huddled in the dark, listening to the sounds of the things trying to phase through the concrete walls. The whispers were growing again, a creeping tide of dread. Then the sky ignited. It wasn't an explosion. It was a spear of pure, silent, white light. It erupted from the main dish of the Scylla array, a perfect, incandescent beam that shot into the heavens with impossible speed. It was so bright, it turned the desert night into a surreal noon. The shadows of the saguaro cacti were etched starkly against the sand. The light was not hot. It was not destructive, not in the way fire is. It was a beam of pure emotion, a silent psalm of defiance, a declaration. Brody, a man who hadn't prayed in 30 years, felt an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. The whispers in his head did not just stop. They were annihilated, burned away by a feeling so pure and powerful it had no name. The survivors around him looked up, tears streaming down their faces, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it was painful. The creatures outside the bunker screamed. It was a sound of pure agony, a shriek of static and tearing reality. They dissolved, unraveling like smoke in a hurricane, their shadowy forms unable to exist in the presence of that light. The beam stayed lit for 3 impossible seconds, a pillar connecting the Arizona desert to a point among the stars. Then, as silently as it appeared, it was gone. The dish of the Scylla array was dark. The platform at its focal point was empty. Jack Carver was gone. There was no ash. There was no crater. There was nothing. His entire being had become the weapon. The silence that followed was different. It was a true silence. The hateful background hum of the universe was gone. The air felt clean. The sky was just a sky again. A canopy of distant, indifferent stars. In Phoenix, a woman named Sarah was sitting in her darkened apartment, a half-empty bottle of wine on the table. For days she had felt a crushing weight, a certainty that her life had been a series of wrong turns. The whisper had told her to call Jack was pointless, that he wouldn't want to hear from her, that it was too late. But then, for just a moment, she felt a sudden, inexplicable warmth, a feeling of profound love and peace that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The weight on her soul vanished. She looked at her phone, and with a clarity she hadn't felt in a week, she knew she had to call him. The phone would ring and ring, and no one would ever answer. But she would never know why she felt the sudden, desperate need to try. Across the globe, the change was instantaneous. In the diner in Harmony Creek, Dale, the owner, blinked, looked around as if waking from a long dream, and started brewing a fresh pot of coffee. In her home, Maria stopped humming and looked with confusion at the corner she'd been sitting in for days. The chittering broadcast was cut. Their hive mind, their central nexus, had been struck by a weapon it could not comprehend. A focused blast of pure humanity. The war was over. No species in the vast cold emptiness of space had believed humanity could weaponize hope. They had studied the young, noisy species on the 3rd planet. They saw their emotions as a weakness, a resource to be harvested. They understood fear, anger, and grief. They could measure and manipulate despair, but hope, To them, hope was an illogical, inefficient denial of reality. A software bug in the mortal condition. They could not conceive that when pushed to the absolute edge, that bug would not cause a system crash, but would instead become a weapon of unimaginable power. They were wrong. In the quiet aftermath, as the sun rose over a wounded but living world, the survivors began to emerge. They would rebuild, they would remember, and they would carry with them the terrifying knowledge of the power that slept within their own hearts. Hope had been their salvation, but it was a weapon forged in sacrifice. A fire that consumed the very thing it was trying to protect. Humanity had survived. It was finally, truly alone with its gods and its monsters. And sometimes, it was impossible to tell the two apart.